Back in 2015, Games Workshop did the unthinkable. It ended Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Older than 40k, Warhammer Fantasy Battles was simply not bringing in the cash, and individual model kits from 40k were outselling the entire setting. So, they ended it, with the good old end times. A year later, something very strange happened as Creative Assembly released Total War Warhammer. As a massive Mark of Chaos fan, I was super duper hyped for this game, but a lot of people were left scratching their noggins. What's the point in this, asked some, as it's not like the game would generate huge sales for a dead IP. The point was, it seemed, to just create a trilogy of great strategy fantasy games, ones that proved not only did people love Warhammer Fantasy, but they also loved being able to play huge battles in the world without forking out thousands on miniatures. Nearly a decade after Warhammer Fantasy shut down, the Total War Warhammer games are a huge success for developer Creative Assembly. Even if the new DLCs for the third game ask way too steep of a price, there are a lot of eyes on this game and wallets ready to spend money on them. The only question is, with 3 games and dozens of DLC under its belt, what does Creative Assembly want to do next? Well, if I'm putting my boring business hat on for a second, I'd say they're going to be making the sequel to Alien Isolation, some more historical Total Wars, and of course, there's still more Warhammer DLC to come. I'm not resting until I see my Monkey King, dammit! However, if we look beyond that at a broader scale, there's no more major releases left to bring out in the Warhammer Fantasy Total War series. The trilogy is complete, and there's not enough content to bring in a 4th game following on the same path. Even if Creative Assembly were to dedicate an entire game to Nagash and perhaps having a story campaign for the end times, people would expect that as a DLC rather than a full release, because they frankly felt ripped off enough. Thanks, CA. So, with the end very much in sight, what happens next? Well, first, I'd say, make sure to tell me yourselves, but maybe don't just put that you want Nagash, because we all do, and we will see that bony boy soon. But after that, the door is really open for CA to bring us something really creative and interesting. They could create another fantasy strategy IP, like Lord of the Rings for example, but they would be mad to leave Warhammer behind forever. There's nothing that quite compares to the scale of Warhammer Fantasy in terms of fantasy IP, with its huge monsters, massive battles and outlandish personalities. And yet, with fantasy done, besides a few additions here and there, the road ahead isn't an obvious one. A hugely popular idea, and one that I've talked about before, is a Warhammer 40,000 Total War game. And while some people think that it won't work due to Creative Assembly not really using modern firearms in Total War, I think there is the potential here to create something that combines what makes Total War great with a distinct 40k feel. Creating a 40k Total War raises a lot of questions. How do you establish faction leaders? Where do you draw faction lines? How do you deal with the fact a Tau railgun could blast every unit in a 50-mile radius without a sweat? Well, these are problems Creative Assembly has dealt with before. Adapting Warhammer Fantasy Battles to the point where each faction felt strong and balanced was a difficult task, especially with world beaters like Mazdamundi, Archaon and Cetra the Imperishable thrown in there. Adapting 40k in a similar way is possible. I think at first we would just need to scale it down. In a similar vein to there only being 5 factions at launch in the first Total War Warhammer game, the first game set in the 41st millennium should in my opinion focus on a singular system which is being fought over by a smaller number of factions. To me, those factions should be the Ultramarines with Militarum backing, the Black Legion, the Orcs and the Eldari, with Necrons as the 5th secret faction that you pre-order because, you know, CA loves that sort of stuff. You'd have 2 bad guys, 2 good guys, a varying mix of ranged and melee powers, alongside plenty of variation in units, tactics and more. Of course you could bring in the Tau instead of the Eldar, Tyranids instead of Orcs, but you get my point. To keep matters simple, I think that Space Marines should be split by chapter so that more factions can come in later down the line. It would feel weird for just one faction to be Space Marines or something like that, as you have so many different units within different chapters and legions that it could just get a bit messy. The Mechanicum I think should be their own faction, as with the Inquisition, but the main thing to take away here is that this game is possible. Major changes to the Total War formula would need to be made, such as making cover an important mechanic, and ensuring that you can still build up settlements properly, whether they be on planets or through building up your ship. I do like the second idea actually, as it would mean that space combat could potentially be a thing too. Either way, for the non-believers out there, my main point is that it can be done. Dawn of War gave us a great strategy game in the 41st millennium, while Total War would want a bigger scale, it's something that technology today is capable of. There's also another potential game set in the grimdark far future, just 10,000 years beforehand, in the Horus Heresy. Conceptually, I think the Horus Heresy would arguably be easier to turn into a Total War game. You wouldn't have the benefit of being able to make the war over a single system, so the map is going to be a lot larger, but otherwise the faction decisions would be made so much easier. Each legion would be its own faction, with the main focus of the combat being centered around Space Marines. The demons from Total War Warhammer 3 would show up on the Chaos side, but units would be a lot less varied, with there being next to no focus on the Xenos. This would suck for some, but it could be a great taster for things to come and a chance for Creative Assembly to see what might work in a true 40k adaptation. Personally, I think if we are going to go for the grim dark far future, I think a smaller scale 40k Total War would be the best bet. People are going to want to play totally different factions rather than just legions, and as I said in my previous video, the Horus Heresy would be best adapted as a more cinematic game rather than a strategy title. If we get to play a bit of 40k fighting over a single planet or system similar to Dawn of War 2, we can explore different factions and see if this idea has any proper weight to it. After all, just because 40k is popular, it doesn't mean that a massive surge of sales would happen with a 40k Total War. I think Creative Assembly knows this too, and I think that's why we're more likely to see some return to fantasy. Now, you might be thinking that because of the old world's return, we could just see Total War Warhammer 4 set in that period. If you're not up to date, Games Workshop basically said that yeah, Warhammer Fantasy is back, but they're not walking back the end times. Instead, we just have a new game with old miniatures set during the time of the Three Emperors. I will probably do another video on that setting when the time comes, but essentially I think this would allow Creative Assembly the chance to keep all the mechanics they've learned from Fantasy while including new units, new legendary lords, and so on. I really don't see how this is worth an entire new game though, unless corporate greed is involved. The map would be the exact same, and so would the vast majority of the units. Even the well-known characters for factions like the Elves, Tomb Kings, and more would be the exact same due to them having been alive for so long. Really, I think the Time of Three Emperors could make for a great expansion or something like that, but to ask people to pay the price of a full game for something that would essentially just be a reskin of what they already know isn't worth it. Which is part of the reason why I think Creative Assembly hasn't really announced what it's going to do next with Warhammer. Warhammer Fantasy is the sacred goat, and it has been slaughtered. There's no putting the blood back in the neck hole. What's done is done, and despite there still being loads of demand for more DLC, one day that's going to dry up, and the developers are going to need to take a risk again. And so, we now fall to the successor of Warhammer Fantasy. Age of Sigmar is a controversial topic among fantasy enjoyers. It's sort of like being the older sibling whose parents have given up on him, so they put all of their efforts into making sure the youngest doesn't disappoint. Just a random thought I had, nothing personal given away there. Anyway, Age of Sigmar has stepped in and actually proven to be rather popular. Its miniatures are really cool and it has a lot of unique lore for itself. It's worth remembering that it's less than 10 years old and has already made a mark for itself within that time. Yeah, the Sigmarines were a little silly at first, and it does try and be Warhammer 40k's little cousin a lot more than Fantasy ever did, but I think a lot of us are aware that the unfortunate truth that Age of Sigmar is the most likely next Total War game. But, and there is a big, shining but here, once again Creative Assembly are going to run into some serious problems. Now, I'm no expert on Age of Sigmar lore, and I would like to start learning, perhaps even making some videos about it, but I do know that we've had the old world swapped out for the mortal realms. Realms which are vague in size and don't really play by the rules of an established world. A lot of factions like the Stormcast Eternals and Seraphon can just teleport onto a field of battle without really having to deal with any of the terrain getting in the way. Realms of Ruin, if anyone remembers that game from last year, had a promising Dawn of War vibe to it. Similarly to how I said we should start a Total War 40k, it focused on one realm with 4 factions vying for supremacy. While the story was good, it ran into a lot of problems, but I think Creative Assembly would have to focus on a similar sort of map scale for a Total War Age of Sigmar. We simply wouldn't be able to have multiple massive realms, and so you'd either have to shrink the realms down with different factions having their own way of traversing them, or just focus on the one. Perhaps we start with the latter and then work our way up to having multiple realms in a single game. It did work with the Realms of Chaos campaign after all. Either way, I think that unlike Realms of Ruin, which fell a bit short on the multiplayer combat as well as just battles in general, Creative Assembly know how to make fantasy fight so well that you wouldn't have to deal with that again. Then again, there are a lot of questions about how you bring such a vast and diverse universe on a comparable level with 40k to an audience that may or may not even know about it. A lot of people got their introduction to Warhammer through Total War or had it revived in a similar manner. So yeah, every single option Creative Assembly has in front of it regarding Warhammer has its own set of problems. Both 40k and Age of Sigmar are huge universes, and fantasy is a well that has all but run dry in terms of full game potential. However, I still can't see Creative Assembly just packing their bags after Nagash, the Dogs of War, and everything else that needs adding to bring Total War Warhammer 3 to its full completion. I've already said that I think Age of Sigmar is the most likely result, but what do I think would actually work best? Well, I'm going to shock you here, kids, but I actually think it would be Warhammer 40,000. Age of Sigmar has its benefits, yes. We get to see characters from the old world, the fantasy battles can largely remain the same, just with new units and refreshed factions, but I think that to really prove how good CA is at making strategy games, it should take this leap of faith on an IP that can work with pretty much any genre. It would be nice to see Age of Sigmar get a game that really puts it on the map, as I don't think we've quite had that yet, but I don't think that game is a Total War title. I think it's something else, something that gives people a better understanding of just what the hell Age of Sigmar is before they gear up to paint a map in their faction's colour. The more I thought about this, the further I got into this script, the more I realised 40k is actually a pretty good option if it starts scaled down. A single system, a single planet even, that's how big the first game should be. The scale of a Warhammer 40k Total War should never take us from the edge of the galaxy to Terra, no matter how many entries this series gets. It's too big, too much for the player to deal with. But what we can have is a traditional Total War that takes the melee combat from fantasy, adding more maneuverability alongside a serious buff to ranged combat. Replace monsters with vehicles, bolster the Chaos armies with the demons they've already made. There are plenty of shortcuts to help progress along, but 40k as a Total War game would be such a massive split from anything we've had before that it would create that intrigue just from existing. Start off with 4 main factions plus a pre-order one because CA, as I said, loves that stuff, and we could see a glimpse at the galactic scale battles we've always read about but never got to fully explore. But yeah, I think it's the game that not only offers us the largest departure from what we know, but it also just has the most potential to be something great. Sorry, Age of Sigmar, I like you, but I don't think it's your time. Not yet. That's all from me today, ghouls and gals. Let me know if you agree, disagree, what you think Creative Assembly should do with Warhammer next, and if you think they should do anything at all. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.